So this is pretty convenient for me, because we've got Paul yet again. So everyone who has me for Daily Mass should be groaning by now. We've been on a Paul binge for the last couple of weeks. We're going to continue doing that, and we're going to keep talking about Paul today. So we heard something very important at the end of the second reading. And I mean, we heard many important things throughout all three of these readings, obviously. But in the first letter to the Thessalonians, we heard something that is entirely consistent with the letter to the Romans. And that means it's something that Paul feels strongly about and communicates clearly and consistently. And I can say that because his first letter to the Thessalonians was the first thing he wrote that survives with us today, and the letter to the Romans is the last thing he wrote. So when we hear the exact same point in an early work and a later work, we know the information is solid. And the line in question is, "We await the Son of God, Jesus, who delivers us from the coming wrath." The coming wrath. What does that mean? Why would Paul write on that on multiple occasions to multiple communities? Well, it's more important to our idea of salvation than you might give it credit for. When Paul says wrath, he means the wrath of law that is absent of any faith or grace. Just pure law. Right and wrong, crime and punishment, black and white. According to my commentary book on the Romans, that understanding of law is, I quote, "a brick wall of God's wrath." All right? And while that sounds unfair at first, Paul's point is perfectly straightforward, and it is of sound deductive logic. It goes a little something like this. All human beings are sinful. All law must inherently punish sin and wrongdoing. Therefore, all human beings are doomed to ongoing and lasting punishment. Do you see why Paul might be concerned with that? If we talk about law as the foundation of salvation, it's a process we will never actually succeed at, and that's a problem. Now, if you're paying attention so far, you are probably instinctively aware of the answer. But if I called on you right now, you'd have trouble putting it into words. Don't worry, I'm not calling on anyone today. I know that our lesson is more challenging than most today. But seriously, in your heart, you know the solution to what I've just explained. The answer is law with some form of mercy in the mix as well. All right? Most of us learn about rules and law from our parents. And our parents love us no matter how sternly they need to be about this or that. All right? So when your parents punish you, there's still mercy in the mix, because there comes a point where enough is enough, and you move on as a family. That is the mercy part, when it comes time to relent. And that is what Paul is saying about God and us. He's saying that if we have law, pure and simple, salvation is closed because no one can expect anything but punishment from the law, because we're all sinners. But with faith that God will do what he promised, we're saved. We're saved by grace, the fact that God is merciful and forgiving. We're saved simply because God wants us to be saved. And it really is that simple. God desires it, that we are saved, and the specifics of the law will not get in the way of that. Example time. What does all this look like? All right, well, let's get a show of hands. How many of you, to this day, remember your meanest and strictest teacher? Okay, I was actually expecting way more hands than that. I was expecting like 90% of people. I mean, how can you forget the meanest teacher of your life? It's For me, those are hard memories to forget. So let's go all the way back to 1990. I was 8 years old, and I was going into second grade. And the worst thing in the world happened. I was assigned to Mr. Johnson's class. And we had 2 second grade teachers. One was the nicest teacher in the school, and the other was the meanest. And of course, Mr. Johnson was the meanest one. So Mr. Johnson had terrified me since the first day of first grade, and I knew that I was doomed when I got him as a teacher for the whole year. Because even then, I knew I was going to fail to please him for long. Eventually, I'd get on his bad side, and doom and wrath would be mine. And again, we're talking about law and punishment. I'm talking about the fact that I was going to be in the wrong, eventually, and there was nothing I could do about it. I could not be the perfect student that apparently you needed to be for Mr. Johnson to not yell at you. And I was right for a while. Mr. Johnson was scary and firm, and I had some rough moments with him, but he was a great teacher as well. I still think of him when I think about how sound travels faster in solids than gases. I think of him when I think of the salt content of the ocean. And seriously, a good chunk of what I do in the classroom with kids comes from his style of teaching. And I still remember the day I was able to relax and let him be a teacher and not just this impossible punisher that I always had to be afraid of. And it was the day that mercy became a reality. See, my family vacations with a family reunion every year about an hour north of here, and the only years I've missed it were the years I was in Africa. That would have been a little too much gas money. But seriously, we go every year. You do not miss this. So in 1990, we went during the school year, and I had to miss 2 days of school. Obviously, my mom called the school, and everything was fine. But I didn't know that because I was 8. And when I came back to school on Monday, I was literally trembling with fear. And at some point that morning, Mr. Johnson, obviously, he could tell how I was feeling. He brought me out into the hallway, knelt down to my level, and said, "Justin, I'm not going to yell at you, and I'm not mad at you." I don't remember what else he said, because it was a while ago, but I remember that I was never afraid of him again after that day. I mean, sure, he was still strict and kind of mean sometimes, but I was done with that neurotic, endless fear that kept me perpetually afraid of him. That was the day that mercy entered into things, and I knew it was going to be okay, even though I was going to mess up over and over again from that point on. Seriously, that is Paul's message today. Pure law generates fear and little else for those of us who are less than perfect. And by the way, that's all of us. Faith and mercy are what make it work. We need at least a little bit of faith and mercy because the world is a terrible place without those things. If you have faith, if you trust that things will work out, even though things clearly aren't perfect, then salvation becomes real and wonderful and beautiful. So I know I'm pushing my time limit by now. There's one more thing I want to add. See, most people are willing to see at least some good in religion, even the ones that don't come to church. Most people have issues with exactly how it's carried out or specific teachings on controversial issues. That's nothing new. But every once in a while, there's someone who's disgusted with the whole idea. You know, the very concepts of God and heaven and hell just fill them with revolt. And I was discussing something spiritual with a friend online back when blogs and live journals were more common than Facebook posts, so this was before Facebook. And I wrote this, something perfectly harmless, and this person just tore into me about how a purely material existence was way better than all that eternity business where God judges you at the very last second and then you're stuck in hell for eternity with no hope of escape. Now back then, I was younger then, I didn't fully understand what the problem was. I knew she was mad. I knew she obviously missed the point of faith in the first place, but beyond that, I couldn't express it clearly or rationally, either to her or myself. But now, the problem is easier for me to see. People like her are stuck in law righteousness, the very thing that Paul is warning us about today in the second reading. They see God as this giant lawyer in the sky. They see a set of rules to obey or reject, and they see reward or punishment. And they're filled with dread, anger, or resentment because they're intelligent and passionate people, God bless them, and they realize that such a reality would equal nothing but wrath and doom. So in short, they understand everything there is to know about religion except faith. And that's not going to work. If there's no mercy, if there's no forgiveness, if there's no compassion, then you ultimately have something that is wrathful and hopeless. That is what happens if you focus on the laws and the rules and ignore the faith, compassion, and mercy. So if you have ever had those thoughts or concerns, I have one piece of advice for you today. Read up on Paul. Faith is the key. Faith that God will make good on his promise to us all, even if we don't understand how, and even if we're going to screw up over and over and over again, no matter how hard we try. Faith is the key. We are saved by grace.